The Trump anti-climate agenda has been handed its first loss in the Senate as 3 Republicans defected against removing an Obama-era rule limiting methane emissions from drilling rigs on public land. Now, this was a 49-51 vote against removing these rules. So the Senate essentially preserved this rule that was passed after last November's election. Now, what this rule did is that it limited the amount of methane that can be vented and burned from oil and gas extraction sites on federal lands. Now, federal lands, that's very, very important. So make sure to remember that, because that actually comes in later, the story of how effective this rule is. Nonetheless, the 3 defections were Senator Lindsey Graham, Suzanne Collins, and a surprise, John McCain. Those 3 Republicans actually voted against removing regulations. Now, isn't that amazing? John McCain, Lindsey Graham. Who would have thought that would happen? Now, originally, Suzanne Collins and Lindsey Graham were already against this, but again, you had that surprise defection by John McCain. So, now, McCain, in a statement, said, quote, improving the control of methane emissions is an important public health and air quality issue. Now, pay attention to that argument. It's an important public health issue. Quote, which is why some states are moving forward with their own regulations, requiring greater investment in recapture technology. While I am concerned that the BLM rule may be onerous, passage of the resolution would have prevented the federal government under any administration from issuing a rule that is similar, according to the plain reading of the Congressional Review Act. Now, the Congressional Review Act, of course, is how Trump has been removing a lot of these Obama-era regulations as to date. Under the 1996 Congressional Review Act, Congress can undo any regulation within 60 days of its finalization and bars agencies from writing a substantially similar rule after that initial rule has been blocked. Now, I think that Congressional Review Act, the way that it's been used has certainly been abused, and I think it's kind of stupid. But I can see why you would actually want something like that as well. Now, it essentially gives Congress a way to block something that a president does. Now, you can block bad things, right? Like, hey, let's, like, for example, the president's like, let's make slavery illegal again. I don't even know if he could do that, but he probably couldn't. But if there was a way that he could make some bad regulation, well, then Congressional Review Act, they can use that to block that rule, right? Now, one of the rules that they tried to block, for example, is, or one of the rules that Obama put into effect that has been repealed with the Congressional Review Act, was the a rule blocking coal companies from dumping their ashes into coal ash pollution into lakes and rivers and lakes and streams. Well, the Trump administration, they took that and they said, we're going to use the Congressional Review Act to get rid of that regulation because we think coal companies should be able to do that. Wonderful. By wonderful, it's actually terrible. But anyway, the bad thing about this is that once you remove that regulation, as the Trump administration has already done to a lot of these, well, you can't pass anything similar, which is a problem. So going back to the coal example, coal companies can no longer ever be stopped through that regulation from polluting your rivers. Now, that's through, from what I understand, that is through executive orders, which is what Trump had to do, or I'm sorry, which Obama had to do to get this stuff passed. Now, I'm assuming they could do something through the Senate, but that would, of course, involve both houses of Congress, and that, under Republican rule, unlikely to happen. Now, while this is a win for environmentalists, it's not a huge win. Now, remember the point that I had you pay attention to earlier, right, where it was through federal land. Well, according to Interior Department data, only 11% of the country's natural gas supply and 5% of its oil is drilled from public land. And unfortunately, that's what this rule and regulation affects. Saying that, yeah, if it's private land, well, then you can do whatever you want with the methane. But if it's on public land, well, you have to make sure to reduce those methane emissions by doing this rule. But still, it is something at least. Small victories and all that. And really, that's, at this point, the best we can hope for. Now, what's interesting is the framing that they used, something that else that I told you to pay attention of. Climate advocates are increasingly framing the fight to scale back greenhouse gas emissions as a public health issue in hopes of using the endangerment finding. Now, the endangerment finding is a somewhat obscure Environmental Protection Agency ruling that requires the federal government to regulate these gases as pollution due to the risk they pose to public health. That's what McCain had said. Hey, man, this could affect public health. So that's why I am ruling, I'm going to vote against removing this rule because I think it will have an impact on the public health. And look, pollution absolutely does have an impact on public health, as does climate change. But they're not using that climate change argument anymore. Instead of saying, hey, climate change, we're going to ruin the planet, well, a lot of people aren't buying that anymore. Or some people aren't buying that anymore. So they're making a different argument and saying, this is going to affect your health. So this is going to affect you. And look, a study done in 2016 did found that, yes, pollution does have a huge impact on health. In fact, 5.5 million people a year die from pollution. Now, most of these deaths are not occurring in the United States, but actually are occurring in China and India. Now, to be fair, the main culprit of those deaths is the emission of small particles from power plants, factories, vehicle exhaust, and from the burning of coal and wood. So it's not just methane, but still, it's more of the particulate matter from the pollution in the air that people are breathing in. So that definitely is a public health issue, but methane is also another one of those gases. Now, methane mainly contributes to climate change, as it is a more potent greenhouse gas. Now, climate change also is a pretty big risk to public health. The things that it's actually going to do: increased intensity of storms, even the release of dormant viruses and bacteria from permafrost. That's a scary story as well. So, but anyway, using the whole risk to public health argument, well, it's a very interesting new way to fight climate changing gases, and that's actually a good thing. Any way that we can fight this is a good thing. Now, if it works, it works. At the end of the day, we've got to do something about the amount of carbon and methane and other greenhouse gases we put in the atmosphere, and as well as ending pollution, trying to keep our air, our water, our soil, and everything else clean. So, look, it's an interesting argument to use. Again, and if it's effective, great. It was effective on Lindsey Graham, John McCain, and Suzanne Collins, so I have to give them 3 credit. They're the only Republicans that voted against removing this rule. So, credit where credit is due. Lindsey Graham, John McCain, and Suzanne Collins. Great vote. So, we appreciate it. Hey, everybody. Thanks for watching this video. If you want to see more like this, please hit the subscribe button below. And if you want to support truly independent progressive media, please consider becoming a patron at patreon.com/TYTNation.